The night was cold, a typical early spring evening in New York City when Patrick McNeil decided to leave his apartment and head out for a night of drinking with friends. A 21-year-old college student at the time, Patrick had just finished a long semester of coursework and was eager to unwind. It was supposed to be a simple night out, filled with laughter, music, and a few drinks. Little did he know it would be his last. Patrick lived in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood in the Bronx, a few blocks away from the banks of the Harlem River. The night had begun with typical college revelry. He met up with two of his closest friends, Jimmy and Eric, at a local bar. Drinks flowed freely and the music grew louder as the night wore on. But things took a strange turn when, later in the evening, Patrick seemed to grow distant. He excused himself, claiming he needed some air, and stepped outside for a breather. His friends didn't think much of it. Patrick often enjoyed a moment alone to clear his head. They stayed at the bar, figuring he'd return soon. But he didn't. Hours passed, and by the time the bar was closing, Patrick had still not returned. His friends assumed he had caught a cab home. But when they tried to call him, there was no answer. Panic began to set in, and they quickly checked the local area, retracing their steps from earlier in the night. They asked bar staff, local police, even some strangers if anyone had seen him, but no one had. The next morning, the unthinkable happened. Patrick's body was discovered in the Harlem River, just a few miles from where he had been drinking. It was a shock to his family and friends. How could a young man, so full of life, have ended up in the water? They couldn't make sense of it. There were no signs of foul play, no blood or bruises on his body. It looked like an accidental drowning. But there was something about the scene that didn't feel right. The river, which had a reputation for being treacherous, was shallow near where his body was discovered. Patrick was a good swimmer. He wasn't the type of person to get drunk and wander off into the water. The police didn't have an explanation, but they chalked it up to a simple accident. Drunk college student falls in the river, tragic but not unusual. Detective Mike Donovan, however, was not convinced. Donovan was a seasoned officer with the NYPD, a man who had spent his entire career unraveling cases that the public often dismissed as accidental. The moment he heard about Patrick's case, something in his gut told him there was more to the story. He personally went to the scene, hoping to find something that might explain what had happened. It was a cold morning when Donovan stood by the river's edge, staring at the spot where the body had been found. The usual police protocol had been followed. Patrick's body was pulled from the water and examined at the morgue, where a cause of death was determined to be drowning. But no one had been able to explain how he had ended up in the water in the first place. As Donovan scoured the area, he noticed something odd. Just a few feet from the riverbank, there was a small piece of graffiti, hardly visible at first, but it was there. A smiley face, painted in what appeared to be bright yellow spray paint, had been etched on the nearby concrete wall. The face was crude and rough, as if someone had hurriedly sprayed it on the wall, yet it felt unsettling. Donovan's instincts kicked in. The face seemed out of place. Why would someone leave a smiley face here? It didn't seem to fit the grim scene of a body found floating in the river. At first, Donovan thought it was just a coincidence. Graffiti was common in New York, especially in the more rundown areas. But as he stood there, staring at the smiley face, something about it gnawed at him. It seemed too intentional, too out of place. Donovan's thoughts were interrupted by his partner, Detective Sarah Adler, who arrived to join him at the scene. "Mike, you seeing this?" she asked, pointing to the smiley face. "I don't like it," Donovan muttered. "It doesn't fit." "Don't be one of those conspiracy theorists, Mike," Sarah said with a small laugh. But even she couldn't completely ignore the eerie feeling that lingered in the air. Something about this case felt wrong. They decided to check the rest of the area, hoping to find something more concrete that could explain Patrick's death. But there was nothing. No clues, no traces of a struggle, no signs of anything that could have led to Patrick's drowning. It was as if he had simply vanished into the night, only to reappear in the water hours later. That evening, Donovan was at his desk when a call came in from one of the junior officers. A similar case had been reported in a different part of the city. A young man, also in his 20s, had been found dead in a different body of water. There was no smiley face this time, but the circumstances were eerily similar. Another young man, another drowning, another unexplained death. Too many coincidences, Donovan muttered under his breath as he hung up the phone. Something was going on, something more than just a series of tragic accidents. But what? For the next few weeks, Donovan worked tirelessly on Patrick's case. He couldn't shake the image of the smiley face from his mind. His investigation led him to a chilling realization. This wasn't just an isolated incident. There were more cases, hundreds of them, stretching back over the years, each one following the same pattern. Young men found dead in bodies of water under mysterious circumstances, and in some cases, smiley faces found nearby. It wasn't long before Donovan discovered the disturbing truth. He wasn't the only one who had made the connection. Across the country, investigators had started to notice the same pattern emerging in their own cases. The victims were often young men in their 20s, last seen drinking with friends, only to later be found drowned. Some of the bodies had signs of physical trauma, but most did not. It seemed like these men had simply been lured into the water. And more chillingly, they all seemed to leave behind some kind of message. The smiley face. The media quickly picked up on the story, and the theory began to spread like wildfire. Was there a serial killer on the loose, targeting young men? And more disturbingly, why the smiley face? What did it mean? Was it a signature, a warning, or something more sinister? But the investigation went no further. The cases remained unsolved, and the smiley face was left as nothing more than a bizarre clue that seemed to lead nowhere. The killer, if there was one, remained out of sight, and the bodies continued to pile up, each one more mysterious than the last. Donovan couldn't let it go. He had seen enough in his years as a detective to know that some cases weren't as simple as they seemed. This one, he realized, was going to be the one that haunted him forever. The question that remained was, who was behind the smiley faces, and what did they want? As the weeks passed, Detective Donovan found himself obsessing over the cases. There were only so many coincidences one could ignore, and it was becoming clear that something far darker was at play. The drownings, the smiley faces. There was a method to the madness, though the full picture remained elusive. Donovan dug deeper into Patrick McNeil's past. He interviewed his friends, his family, anyone who might have had some insight into his life and habits. What he discovered was unsettling. Patrick wasn't the type to drink himself into oblivion and wander off into the river. In fact, he had no history of risky behavior. He was a quiet student, focused on his education, someone who seemed well-rounded, stable. Nothing in his background suggested he would end up the victim of an accidental drowning. But there was something about his death that raised alarms for Donovan. Patrick's friends reported that he was fine when they last saw him at the bar, and nothing unusual had happened that night. He had been in good spirits, enjoying the company of his friends. Why would he suddenly slip away without warning, without telling anyone? The idea that he had simply stumbled into the water out of drunken carelessness seemed increasingly unlikely. It wasn't until Donovan started examining other similar cases that things began to make sense. He couldn't ignore the pattern any longer. Young men, many from similar backgrounds, were found dead in bodies of water. Most had drowned, but some had been found with strange injuries, as if they had been dragged or struggled before dying. And in several of these cases, there was always something odd. A smiley face drawn somewhere near the scene. The next victim Donovan turned his attention to was a man named Ryan Spencer, who had disappeared just weeks after Patrick. Ryan had been out with friends in Boston, and much like Patrick, he had excused himself from the group for some air, only to be found dead in the Charles River a few days later. His body was discovered under eerily similar circumstances. No sign of struggle, no major injuries, just a young man found in a place he shouldn't have been. But there was something different this time. Ryan's body had been positioned differently than Patrick's, and this time, there was a more intricate smiley face painted on a nearby wall. The face was almost cartoonish, with large, exaggerated eyes and a wide grin that made Donovan shiver when he saw it. As he examined the smiley face more closely, he noticed something even more disturbing. The spray paint had been applied in a deliberate pattern, almost as if the killer had used a stencil or a tool to create it. The face wasn't just hastily sprayed like the one near Patrick's body. This one was precise, measured. It seemed like an artist's touch, not the random scribble of a vandal. Donovan had seen plenty of murder scenes in his career, but nothing had ever unsettled him quite like this. It was as though the killer was playing a twisted game, one where the clues were left in plain sight but still hidden just out of reach. It felt personal, like the killer was taunting everyone involved, daring them to figure out the truth. As the cases began to pile up, Donovan noticed another disturbing trend. Most of the victims had been in good health, no major drug or alcohol problems, and yet they all seemed to meet a similar end. Some were discovered in rivers, others in lakes, and a few in more obscure bodies of water, far from any natural sources. What was even more chilling was that each body appeared to have been placed in the water, not just left to drift in from accidental means. Donovan knew this wasn't just a series of random drownings. This was something much more sinister. The smiley face, though seemingly juvenile, was a chilling signature, one that made Donovan feel as if he were being drawn into a game he couldn't escape from. He started to connect dots, but the deeper he dug, the more questions arose. He called in his team to help him investigate the growing number of deaths, though he didn't yet reveal his theory. He didn't want anyone to dismiss it as paranoia. But it wasn't long before his suspicions were confirmed. There were more cases. The drownings, the smiley faces, the strange placement of the bodies, it was happening in cities across the United States, from Chicago to Los Angeles, from Miami to Seattle. But it wasn't just the United States. As Donovan's investigation spread, he found similar patterns in Europe. 2 young men from seemingly normal backgrounds, found dead in rivers or lakes, their deaths unexplained, their bodies carefully arranged. And in each case, a smiley face had appeared nearby, marking the spot where they had been left to die. At this point, Donovan knew he couldn't ignore the disturbing possibility any longer. There was a serial killer on the loose, a killer who was methodical, precise, and always seemed to be one step ahead of the law. The cases began to make headlines, and soon the media caught wind of the unsettling connections. Local news stations, online forums, and true crime enthusiasts began to speculate about the killer's identity. Theories ran wild, and the public was gripped by fear and fascination. Who was the person behind these deaths? Why had they targeted these specific young men? And, most chilling of all, why the smiley face? As the story spread, Donovan found himself under pressure. His team was stretched thin, trying to follow leads that seemed to dry up as quickly as they emerged. And still, the killer remained elusive. One night, Donovan sat at his desk, surrounded by case files, trying to make sense of everything. The smiley face, the bodies in water, the deliberate choice of victims, all of it gnawed at him. But what stood out the most was the killer's apparent indifference. The smiles, those taunting, mocking faces, felt like an invitation. An invitation to a game that Donovan wasn't sure he was ready to play. Suddenly, he had an idea. What if the smiley face wasn't just a signature? What if it was a clue, a message? The killer wasn't just marking their territory. They were sending a warning. But to whom? The game, Donovan realized, wasn't just for the police. It was for the victims. The killer wasn't just playing with the law, they were playing with life and death itself. And somewhere, deep in the twisted mind of this predator, the smiley face meant something much darker. Something that was still hidden, buried beneath layers of cryptic messages and unsettling clues. Donovan was determined to find the answer. But as he dug deeper, he couldn't shake the feeling that the killer was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. The more Detective Donovan delved into the cases, the deeper he sank into the twisted web spun by the Smiley Face Killer. Each new lead, each new victim only seemed to add layers to a mystery that was growing more complicated and sinister by the day. As the media frenzy surrounding the killings escalated, so did the fear and tension across the country. What had begun as a handful of isolated drownings now appeared to be the work of a calculating serial killer. But who was this predator? And what was their endgame? One thing was certain, the killer was smart. Too smart. They were always one step ahead of law enforcement, leaving behind only cryptic symbols and the bodies of young men who seemed to have no connection to each other. At first, it seemed as if the victims were random, but Donovan's gut told him that wasn't the case. There was a hidden thread tying them all together. The turning point came when Donovan received a phone call from a retired FBI profiler, Dr. Olivia Banks. She had been following the case from the sidelines and had come to the conclusion that the Smiley Face Killer was someone who derived pleasure from the fear they instilled in others. Her theory was that the killer was not only leaving the smiley faces as a signature but as a psychological weapon designed to toy with the minds of both the police and the public. The smiley face isn't just a signature, Dr. Banks explained over the phone. It's an invitation, a provocation. The killer wants people to know what they've done, but they also want them to figure it out. They want the thrill of the chase. They're playing a game and they're enjoying every moment of it. Donovan mulled over her words. It made sense. The killer wasn't just hiding in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. They were leaving clues, taunting the authorities. Every time a new body was discovered, it was as if the killer was daring them to connect the dots. And, as disturbing as it was, Donovan had to admit that the smiley face was both a signature and a challenge, one the killer was winning. Dr. Banks continued, "I believe this killer is extremely methodical. They know exactly how to blend in to remain unnoticed. They could be anyone, anywhere. They're not leaving any obvious patterns to their behavior. But there's one thing that's constant, the smiley face. It's almost as if they're enjoying the fear and confusion they're causing. I would bet that this is someone who's watching the news, watching the investigations, and laughing at the police as they struggle to put the pieces together." Donovan's mind raced. If Dr. Banks was right, the killer wasn't just a random predator. They were someone who understood the psychological game they were playing, a predator who wanted to be chased, who wanted to toy with their prey before striking. And it was becoming clearer, this wasn't just about killing. It was about control. The killer wanted to control the narrative, control the fear, and control the investigation itself. The next breakthrough came when Donovan's team identified a connection between some of the victims. It wasn't much, just a small detail, but it was enough to raise a red flag. Several of the victims had attended the same university, or at least had some loose connection to it. This seemed like a potential link, but it wasn't enough to make a definitive connection. Donovan arranged for a meeting with the university's campus security team. He was hoping to learn more about the victims' personal lives, but what he uncovered was even more chilling. According to campus staff, there had been reports of strange behavior around the time of the drownings. Students had complained about a man who seemed to be lurking around campus, often near the river or near popular hangout spots for students. Some of the reports described him as watching the students, but no one could ever pinpoint exactly who he was or what he was doing there. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. Donovan began to suspect that the killer was someone who had spent time on the university campuses, perhaps even someone who had been a student there at one point. He started to dig into the school's records, looking for any clues that might tie a former student or faculty member to the strange occurrences around the drownings. The more he investigated, the more he realized that the killer could be someone who had intimate knowledge of student life, their habits, their routines, and their vulnerabilities. But there was still one key question that haunted Donovan: why the smiley faces? What did they mean? It wasn't just some twisted symbol left behind for no reason, it was deliberate, calculated. Every smiley face was different, but they all shared the same mocking, taunting quality. As if the killer was saying, "I'm smarter than you. You'll never catch me." Donovan knew that in order to catch this killer, he needed to think like them. He had to understand what drove them, what they wanted. The smiley face, he realized, was a piece of the puzzle, one that he needed to solve if he ever hoped to stop the killer. As the investigation continued, Donovan's team tracked down more potential witnesses who claimed to have seen strange figures near the bodies of water where the victims had been discovered. Some of these witnesses described a man who appeared out of place, too calm, too composed, and always watching from a distance. Others mentioned the smell of fresh paint near the crime scenes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to suggest that the killer was always present, lurking in the background even when no one knew they were there. Then came the terrifying breakthrough. A local artist who had been following the media coverage of the case came forward with a shocking revelation. He had been contacted by a mysterious individual who wanted to commission a series of paintings. The subject? Smiley faces. The artist had thought it was a strange request at the time, but had gone along with it. It wasn't until he saw the news reports about the murders that he realized the connection. The man who had commissioned the paintings was eerily familiar. He recognized him from a sketch of one of the witnesses. Donovan's heart raced as he reviewed the details. It was the break he had been waiting for, a link between the killer and someone who was living among them, someone who was hiding in plain sight. The hunt for the killer was on. But Donovan couldn't shake the feeling that with every step they took forward, the killer was always watching, always a step ahead. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The breakthrough Donovan had been waiting for had come, and it was chilling. The artist's confession about the strange commission had added a new layer to the investigation. The smiley face killer had been hiding in plain sight, blending in with the rest of the world while creating his twisted pieces of art. It felt like the walls were closing in, but Donovan knew they were still a long way from uncovering the true identity of the killer. The first step was tracking down the artist. His name was Vincent Duran, a painter in his late 30s who had gained some recognition in the local art community for his abstract work. He wasn't known for anything that was too bizarre or unsettling, which made his involvement in the case even stranger. But when Donovan and his team arrived at his studio, Duran seemed genuinely surprised. Look, I didn't know anything about these murders, Duran said nervously, wiping his hands on a rag as he sat down on a stool. The guy who contacted me, he was just some guy. He gave me a check up front and asked for these smiley faces. Said he was going to use them for a private collection. I never thought much of it. Artists get weird requests all the time. Do you have any idea who he was? Donovan pressed. Duran hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He didn't give me much. He had a deep voice, wore a baseball cap. He wasn't the kind of guy I'd normally talk to, you know? But he paid well, so I did what he asked. I didn't ask questions. Do you remember anything else about him? Donovan pushed. Duran thought for a moment, his eyes shifting nervously. There was something strange about the way he looked at me. It was like he was studying me, watching me, but I swear, I don't know who he is. He never told me his name. Donovan's gut told him this wasn't just a coincidence. The killer had approached Duran to create those same smiley faces that had been appearing at crime scenes. It was too deliberate to be random, too chilling to be ignored. The killer had been feeding his obsession with control and manipulation into these paintings, using the artist to spread his signature. While Duran didn't have any more useful information, his encounter with the man triggered something in Donovan's mind. What if the killer wasn't just a random individual but someone who knew how to exploit the vulnerabilities of people? Someone who could blend into everyday life while hiding their dark side? Donovan turned his attention to the sketch that had been drawn of the witness who'd seen the man near the crime scenes, the one who had described the strange figure lingering near the water. He began to compare the description with any known suspects, pulling files from across the country, hoping to find some kind of connection. Then came the chilling revelation. A former student at the university, someone who had lived in the area around the time the first drownings had occurred, had been arrested years ago for a minor offense. His name was Jason J. Richards. A troubled young man, he had been involved in several incidents of vandalism and had a history of mental health issues. His arrest was unrelated to the murders, but he had been known to frequent the areas where the drownings had occurred. The more Donovan dug into Richards' past, the more the pieces started to fall into place. Richards had been obsessed with water as a child. His parents reported that he had a strange fascination with rivers and lakes, often standing on the banks for hours, staring out into the water as though he were waiting for something. As he grew older, his obsession only intensified. Friends described him as a quiet loner, someone who never quite fit in but had an unsettling presence that made people uneasy. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prompt Donovan to take a closer look. Richards had vanished a few years ago, disappearing from the public eye after a brief stint in a psychiatric facility. No one had heard from him since. As Donovan worked tirelessly to piece together Richards' history, his team began to uncover disturbing details. Richards had been obsessed with symbols, particularly smiley faces. He had even drawn them in his notebooks, along with cryptic phrases and dark imagery. The more they looked into his life, the more they realized that Richards had been harboring deep psychological issues, ones that seemed to have festered and grown over time. But the most chilling detail came from Richards' old therapist. She revealed that Richards had been fixated on the idea of drowning. He had spoken about the sensation of being submerged in water, about the control he felt over life and death when he imagined himself in that space. He had described it in the most unsettling terms, like he was the one who decides when you come up for air, when you die, and when you live. As Donovan read these notes, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The words were too close to the drowning cases. Richards didn't just want to kill, he wanted to control the very moment of life and death. The smiley face, Donovan realized, wasn't just a signature. It was a symbol of control, a marker for the predator to claim his victims and leave his twisted mark on the world. Determined to find out where Richards was hiding, Donovan and his team tracked his last known whereabouts to a small town near a lake in upstate New York. Richards had been living under an assumed name, working odd jobs, and keeping a low profile. But Donovan's instincts told him that Richards was close and he was ready to strike again. When they arrived at the small cabin Richards had been renting, Donovan felt the air grow thick with tension. The place was isolated, surrounded by dense woods and a quiet, still lake. It was the perfect hiding place for someone like Richards. As they approached the cabin, Donovan noticed something chilling: fresh paint, yellow and vivid, smeared on the wooden fence outside. A smiley face. Donovan's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. They were so close. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Richards was watching them, waiting for them to make the next move. As the team surrounded the cabin, Donovan heard a sound, a low, almost imperceptible scrape. It came from inside the house. The hunt was over. The Smiley Face Killer had been found. But Donovan couldn't help but wonder, was Richards really the mastermind behind the killings? Or was he just a pawn in a much larger, more terrifying game? The moment Donovan stepped into the cabin, his gut told him that the case was far from over. The smiley face on the fence had been the final, unmistakable clue. But as they moved into the small, dimly lit living room, the killer's presence lingered like an ominous shadow. The place was disturbingly clean, devoid of personal belongings, and yet it felt like something had been left behind, an invisible mark that the killer was still there, watching, waiting for the moment they would be discovered. Donovan's team carefully moved through the cabin, their footsteps echoing in the silence. But there was nothing. No sign of Richards. No trace of the killer. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. It was unsettling. Everything about this case felt like a cruel game, with the killer always staying one step ahead. "Check the back," Donovan instructed his team. "I'll take the attic." His flashlight beam sliced through the darkness as he climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The wooden boards creaked under his weight. His mind was racing. Had they finally found him? Or had he slipped away, like so many of his victims, leaving only a trail of blood and symbols in his wake? Donovan's eyes scanned the cluttered attic, filled with boxes, old furniture, and discarded objects. His light flicked across the room, and then it stopped on something that made his heart skip a beat. There, on the floor, was a large canvas. The painting was unmistakable, bright yellow, vivid, and unnervingly familiar. A smiley face. But this wasn't just a simple doodle. This was a masterpiece. The face was eerily lifelike, with wide, gaping eyes and a grin that seemed to stretch unnaturally. It felt as though it were mocking him, taunting him, daring him to understand its meaning. Donovan felt a surge of revulsion. He knelt beside it, his fingers tracing the edge of the canvas. This was no ordinary painting. As he examined it further, he realized that the eyes of the smiley face were different. Not just drawn, but layered with something strange. There were small, almost imperceptible photographs embedded in the pupils, pictures of the victims. And behind the smile, almost hidden in the strokes of yellow paint, were the words, "You're next." Donovan felt a cold shiver run through him. This wasn't just a signature anymore. It wasn't just a sick game. The killer was leaving a warning, a personal message for him. The killer wasn't finished with his hunt, not by a long shot. "Mike," one of his officers called from below, his voice laced with urgency. "You need to see this." Donovan's heart pounded as he made his way down to the ground floor, his mind racing. What now? What had they found? When he reached the living room, his eyes were immediately drawn to a folder sitting on the coffee table. It was thick, filled with pages of carefully typed notes. Donovan flipped through them quickly, his hands shaking. These weren't random ramblings. These were meticulously organized, like a journal or diary of some kind. The killer's thoughts, carefully documented, revealing the twisted mind behind the killings. It was then that Donovan realized something that chilled him to the bone. Jason Richards wasn't the killer. The true mastermind behind the murders had been hiding in the shadows the whole time. The notes in the folder revealed something far more disturbing than Donovan had anticipated. Richards had been manipulated, his mind twisted by someone far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The killer, it seemed, had been grooming him for years. Jason Richards was nothing more than a pawn in a much larger, more complex game. The documents were filled with references to an individual who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, someone with a deep psychological understanding of human behavior. The notes hinted at a long history of psychological manipulation, beginning with Richards' childhood obsession with water and control, but stretching far beyond that. The man behind the murders, it seemed, had been a teacher, a mentor, someone who had met Richards years ago and had slowly and methodically shaped his thoughts, molding him into the perfect killer. This individual had been feeding Richards ideas, giving him instructions on how to carry out the drownings, how to leave the smiley faces behind. The killer wasn't just a random psychopath. They were a mastermind, a predator who had taken advantage of Richards' vulnerabilities and used them as a means to an end. Donovan's mind raced as he tried to process the implications. Who could have done this? Who had the power, the patience, and the cruelty to manipulate someone like Jason Richards? Someone who could remain in the shadows for so long, orchestrating each death, each drowning, each smiley face with such chilling precision. As the hours passed, Donovan continued to sift through the notes, uncovering more and more about the killer's plan. The true identity of the mastermind was still a mystery, but one thing became increasingly clear. The killer was not just a lone individual. They were part of a much larger, more insidious web. The final revelation came when Donovan discovered a list of names at the back of the folder. The names of potential future victims. And one of those names stood out: Detective Mike Donovan. Donovan felt a rush of adrenaline. The killer had been watching him, studying him just as he had done with all of the other victims. Donovan wasn't just investigating the murders, he was now part of the game. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The killer had been leading him down a path, pushing him closer and closer to the truth, all while playing a game of cat and mouse. The smiley face wasn't just a symbol of the killer's identity. It was a reminder, a threat. The killer was still out there, still controlling the narrative, still pulling the strings. And now, Donovan knew he was next. Donovan couldn't shake the weight of the revelation. The killer, or rather the true mastermind behind the killings, wasn't just hiding in the shadows. They were actively manipulating the investigation, playing him like a puppet on a string. The realization that he was now part of the killer's twisted game was enough to send a chill down his spine. Every move, every clue, every moment he thought he was closing in on the truth, he was being watched. It was all part of the plan. The note with his name on it, buried at the back of the folder, felt like a countdown. The killer was calculating, patient, and now they were in control. Donovan had to face it. This wasn't just a case he was trying to solve. It was an active pursuit, a race against time where every step forward meant the killer could be one step closer to his downfall. Donovan had always prided himself on his instincts, his ability to see through the darkness. But now, that same darkness felt suffocating, closing in on him from every side. He knew the killer was smart, smarter than anyone they'd encountered before. The mind behind the smiley faces had been carefully orchestrating each death, each clue, as if they were creating a twisted masterpiece. And now, Donovan was the centerpiece of the game. The chilling thought haunted him as he sat in his car, staring out at the endless stretch of dark road. His mind kept going back to the folder, the notes that detailed the killer's manipulation of Richards. How long had this been in the making? How long had the true killer been pulling the strings, watching from the shadows, as people's lives were taken one by one? He couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. Time was running out. Donovan knew he needed answers, but he had to tread carefully. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that the killer was playing multiple levels of the game. Jason Richards wasn't the mastermind, but he was a vital part of the story. Richards had been the tool, the instrument, the victim who had unknowingly carried out the orders. But who was the true puppet master? Who had designed this sickening dance of death? That night, Donovan couldn't sleep. His mind churned, analyzing every detail of the investigation, every name, every person connected to the victims. He went over his files again, retracing the steps that had led him here. It was only when he reached the section about the university, where many of the victims had been connected, that he found something that made his heart stop. The name that kept popping up in his investigation was Professor Henry Carver. Carver had been a respected professor in psychology at the university, known for his work on criminal behavior and mental disorders. His research on manipulation and control had been groundbreaking, and it was clear that he had a deep understanding of the human mind. But as Donovan looked closer at Carver's background, he found something that made his stomach turn. Carver had been involved in an unethical study years ago, a controversial experiment on manipulating student behavior using psychological techniques. The study was shut down after a series of complaints, but there was no public record of what had happened to Carver after that. Carver had disappeared shortly after the scandal. His name had been scrubbed from all university records, and there were whispers that he had left the country, but there were no concrete leads. Except now, it appeared Carver was connected to every one of the killings. Donovan's pulse quickened as he pieced together the chilling truth. It wasn't just that Carver had been an expert in psychological manipulation, he had been practicing it for years. What if Carver had been the one to groom Jason Richards, exploiting his vulnerabilities to create the perfect killer. What if he had been using the smiley faces as a way to communicate with Richards, guiding him on every step of his twisted path? Donovan was no longer sure who the killer was. The more he uncovered, the more questions he had. Was Carver orchestrating everything from behind the scenes, or was he merely a cog in the machine, a willing accomplice to someone even more dangerous? Was there someone else pulling the strings? Someone even more sinister than he could have imagined? The more he thought about it, the more the answer became clear. The killer wasn't a single person. It was a system, a network of people who had been working together for years, manipulating the lives of others to fulfill their own dark desires. Donovan needed to confront Carver. He needed to know the truth, even if it meant putting himself in direct danger. But there was a problem. Carver had vanished. No one had seen him in years, and the trail had gone cold. Frustration mounted as Donovan tried to figure out where Carver might be hiding. He wasn't just a professor or a psychologist. He was a predator who knew how to stay hidden, how to manipulate the situation. Every step Donovan took to find him seemed to lead to a dead end. As he sat in his office late into the night, the phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Donovan," a cold, familiar voice said on the other end. "I see you've been doing your homework." It was the killer. Donovan's heart stopped. He had been expecting this. He had known it was only a matter of time before the killer made contact. He had been part of the game for so long now that it was impossible to know where the investigation ended and the killer's manipulation began. "I've been watching you, Donovan," the voice continued, almost amused. "You're getting closer, but not close enough. Do you really think you understand the game? The pieces you're moving around, they're mine. You're just following orders, just like everyone else." Donovan's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a threat. This was a confession. The killer was telling him that he was no longer in control. He was just a player in a game that had been going on far longer than he realized. "I'll find you," Donovan said, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "And when I do, this game will end." The voice on the other end of the line laughed, a low, mocking sound. "You think you're the one who decides when the game ends? You've been playing by my rules all along, Donovan. And I'm afraid the end is already written." The line went dead. Donovan slammed the phone down, his mind racing. The killer had made it clear he was in control. But Donovan wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He had to keep going. He had to finish this. And he would. But the question remained, was he ready to face the truth, no matter how horrifying it was? The phone call had rattled Donovan to his core. Every moment of this investigation had been a game, one where the stakes grew higher, the rules twisted, and the killer had always held the upper hand. But now Donovan realized the truth. He wasn't just chasing shadows, he was part of the killer's plan all along. His every move had been carefully orchestrated, every decision manipulated by a predator who was always 2 steps ahead. The killer's voice echoed in his mind, the mocking tone, the chilling words that had made it clear this wasn't about solving a crime anymore. It was about control. The killer had been using him, feeding him information just enough to keep the chase alive, to keep him invested in the game. And now Donovan was trapped. But Donovan wasn't ready to give in. He couldn't. The darkness, the terror the killer had caused, had consumed enough lives. He had to stop it. He had to bring the killer down, no matter the cost. The first thing Donovan did was track down every remaining lead. Carver, Richards, the university. The missing pieces all pointed to something bigger than he could have imagined. The investigation was no longer just a hunt for a single murderer, it was unraveling into a web of manipulation, control, and psychological games, each thread linked to people who had been victims long before they ever became murderers. With a renewed sense of urgency, Donovan gathered his team. They couldn't afford to miss anything. As they pieced together Richards' background, they found disturbing gaps in his history. Richards had been in therapy for years, most of it undocumented. It seemed that the therapy sessions were more than just counseling, they were part of an experiment. The breakthrough came when one of the officers discovered an old set of documents from the university. They were records of a controversial study conducted by Professor Henry Carver years ago, one that had been deemed unethical and shut down before it could reach completion. The study was meant to explore the effects of extreme psychological manipulation on students, specifically focusing on control, coercion, and influence. And the most disturbing part? Richards had been one of the subjects. It all started to make sense. Carver had been using his position of authority to conduct an experiment on unsuspecting students, rich with potential to manipulate, to control, to create the perfect killers. Richards, already struggling with mental health issues, had been the ideal candidate. Carver's experiments had twisted his mind, turning him into a pawn in a much larger, more terrifying game. But Carver wasn't just an academic with a dangerous interest in psychology. He had been the orchestrator of the sickening plan, using Richards as a tool to carry out his dark desires. Richards wasn't the only one. He had been part of a much larger experiment, an ongoing project that spanned years, and Carver had quietly been pulling the strings all along. Donovan's heart raced as he connected the dots. Richards wasn't the mastermind. He had been manipulated into becoming a killer. But Carver had been the one behind it all. The experiments, the control, the manipulations. Carver had carefully crafted this game for years, using the smiley faces as both a signature and a threat, letting his victims know that they were part of something much larger than themselves. The question was, where was Carver now? Donovan didn't have to wait long for an answer. A few hours later, one of his officers received an anonymous tip. It was a single sentence, typed in a cold, clinical font. The game ends at the old asylum. Donovan didn't need to ask any questions. He knew exactly what it meant. The old asylum had been abandoned for years, its halls echoing with memories of lost souls and forgotten experiments. It had been the site of numerous unethical practices in its day, including psychological tests and physical restraints used on patients, many of whom were treated like nothing more than lab rats. The asylum was where it had all started for Carver. It was where he had perfected his manipulations, where the experiment had begun, and where, it seemed, it would end. Donovan didn't waste any time. He gathered his team, ordered them to suit up, and prepared for the final confrontation. He knew the killer was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. But now, Donovan had the upper hand. He wasn't just playing by the killer's rules anymore. He was going to end this, one way or another. The drive to the asylum was long, the darkness pressing in on every side. The air grew heavier with each passing mile, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. The storm clouds overhead seemed to mirror the chaos brewing in Donovan's mind. As the car pulled up to the decrepit building, the first thing he noticed was the silence. It was so absolute, so unnatural. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The old asylum loomed before them, its broken windows staring out like empty eyes, the walls sagging with the weight of years gone by. It was the perfect place for a man like Carver to hide. A place where he could remain in the shadows, manipulating everyone around him, watching his experiment unfold. As Donovan and his team entered the building, the sense of dread was almost overwhelming. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and the sound of their footsteps echoed eerily through the empty halls. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It felt as though they were walking into the heart of the killer's lair, a place where all the pieces of the twisted puzzle would finally come together. And then they found it. In the center of a large room, illuminated by the faint glow of a single flickering light, was a large canvas. Another smiley face. But this one was different. This wasn't just a painting. This was a message. A final piece of the killer's game. As Donovan approached it, his breath caught in his throat. The face was distorted, the eyes dark and hollow, and the smile twisted into something grotesque. Carver's voice echoed from the shadows. "You finally made it, Donovan," Carver said, stepping into the dim light. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but his grin was wide, almost mocking. "I wondered how long it would take for you to catch up." Donovan's pulse quickened as he stepped forward. "It ends tonight, Carver." Carver's laugh sent a chill down his spine. "You think you can stop me? You've been part of my game from the beginning. Every move you've made, every decision you've made, has been mine to orchestrate. You're no better than Jason Richards." Donovan's eyes narrowed. "You've ruined enough lives. It's over." Carver's smile widened, and in that moment, Donovan realized that the true horror of this game wasn't just the killings, it was the fact that Carver was playing a game he thought he could never lose. The tension in the asylum was unbearable. Every step Donovan took toward Carver seemed to be a step further into the twisted nightmare the killer had meticulously constructed over the years. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty, decaying halls, mocking the illusion of control that he still clung to. Carver stood before him, calm and collected, as though everything had been leading to this moment. His smile was unnerving, a contrast to the decaying surroundings that seemed to reflect the ruin of his mind. Carver's eyes glinted with a mixture of amusement and something darker, something far more dangerous. "You're a fool, Donovan," Carver said, his voice smooth, almost soothing. "You think you're the one who gets to make the decisions now? You've been part of my experiment from the start. You just didn't realize it. Donovan's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure how long he could stand the weight of Carver's words. Every time he thought he understood the killer's motives, the game shifted. Every time he thought he was one step closer to solving the puzzle, a new twist emerged. Now, standing in the heart of the nightmare, Donovan understood the depths of Carver's manipulation. "It's over, Carver," Donovan said, his voice unwavering. "You've hurt enough people. Your game ends here." Carver tilted his head, his grin widening. "You think it's that simple? You think you can just come in here, throw around a few threats, and it will be over? No, no, no. You're not the one who gets to end this. I decide when the game is finished." Carver's calm demeanor sent a shiver down Donovan's spine. The killer wasn't just trying to outsmart him, he was trying to break him, to force him into playing by his rules. It was clear now that Carver wasn't interested in a fair fight. He wanted to control everything. And that included Donovan. But Donovan wasn't going to fall for it. "Why?" Donovan asked, his voice cutting through the silence. "Why the smiley faces? Why the game?" Carver's eyes sparkled as though he had been waiting for the question. "The smiley face is the symbol of the perfect predator, Donovan. The one who watches and waits. The one who controls. It's not about the killings. It's about the control, the ability to manipulate people into doing exactly what I want. The smiley face is a reminder to all of them, a warning that I am always watching." Donovan clenched his fists, fighting the anger that was bubbling up inside him. "You used Jason. You used so many people as pawns in your game. You destroyed their lives." Carver's smile faltered for a moment, but only briefly. "I didn't destroy anything. I liberated them. I gave them purpose. You see, Donovan, people are weak. They need to be controlled. They need guidance. And I gave them exactly that. Richards, for example, he was always a lost soul, just waiting for someone to show him the way." Donovan's gaze hardened. "You twisted him into a killer." "I liberated him," Carver corrected, his voice almost a whisper. "I showed him his true potential." Donovan's pulse quickened. The room seemed to close in around him as he realized just how much Carver had been manipulating everything. The killer wasn't just a maniacal murderer, he was a puppet master, pulling strings from behind the scenes, turning people into instruments of his will. And in that moment, Donovan understood just how deep Carver's control ran. But as much as Carver wanted to maintain his facade of power, Donovan could see the cracks. Carver was desperate to maintain the illusion of control, to continue the game. But Donovan wasn't playing anymore. He was done being a pawn. "You're sick," Donovan spat. "And you're going to rot in prison for the rest of your life." Carver's smile never wavered. "You think I'll let that happen? You think you can catch me now, after all this time? You can't stop me, Donovan. You never could." Donovan's hands tightened around the gun he had pulled from his holster, the metal cold against his skin. But he didn't fire. Not yet. He had to think. He had to outsmart Carver just one more time. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from behind him. Donovan's head snapped toward the sound, his heart racing. The door to the asylum slammed open, and in the darkness, shadows moved swiftly toward them. Donovan's pulse spiked. He wasn't alone. "Get down!" Donovan shouted, ducking behind a rusted column just as gunfire erupted. His heart thudded in his chest as the room was filled with the deafening sound of bullets tearing through the air. Carver, who had been calm up until now, dropped to the floor with unnatural speed, his face twisted in a mix of fear and frustration. Donovan's instincts kicked in. He grabbed for his radio, his hands trembling. "I need backup. Now." The silence that followed the gunfire was suffocating. Donovan risked a glance around the column just in time to see a figure emerge from the shadows. But this figure wasn't Carver, it was someone else. Someone Donovan recognized. It was Jason Richards. But something was wrong. Richards' face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, as though he was seeing something that wasn't there. His movements were jerky, disjointed. It was as though he wasn't fully in control of his own body. The moment their eyes met, Richards let out a strange, guttural cry, almost as if he was caught between two worlds. "Jason!" Donovan called out, but Richards didn't respond. Instead, he turned, his hands shaking, and staggered toward Carver, who was now slowly getting to his feet. Donovan's stomach dropped. Something was terribly wrong. Richards wasn't acting like himself. He was controlled. "Jason, stop!" Donovan shouted, but Richards didn't listen. His eyes were locked onto Carver with an almost reverent look, as if he were following an order he couldn't resist. Carver, who had been struggling to stand, now smirked. "It's too late for him, Donovan. He's mine. He's been mine from the start." Donovan's heart raced as he realized what had happened. Richards hadn't been freed from Carver's control. He had merely become a puppet, a tool that Carver could control at will. Donovan wasn't facing a killer anymore, he was facing a man who had been broken, reprogrammed, and turned into a weapon. In that moment, Donovan understood the full extent of Carver's power. He wasn't just playing with people's lives, he was twisting them, shaping them, breaking their will until they were nothing but tools for his sick purposes. And now Donovan was next. "Jason, fight it," Donovan shouted, reaching out, trying to pull Richards away. But Richards' eyes locked onto him, and for the first time, Donovan saw a flicker of recognition before it was drowned out by the darkness that had taken over. The game wasn't over yet, but Donovan was running out of time. Donovan's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Jason Richards, the once innocent man now twisted into something unrecognizable. The desperation in Richards' eyes was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness, like a marionette whose strings had been pulled too tight. The young man Donovan had tried to save was now merely a vessel for Carver's control, moving at the killer's will. "Jason, fight it," Donovan shouted, his voice breaking through the tension that filled the asylum. But Richards didn't respond. He just stood there, eyes glazed over, his body stiff with an unnerving precision. Carver stood to his feet, his expression calm and almost victorious. He wiped a smear of blood from his lip, the remnants of a shallow cut from the earlier gunfire. "You don't get it, Donovan," Carver said softly, almost pityingly. "This was always the plan. You were never meant to win. You never had a chance." Donovan's mind raced as he realized what Carver was doing. Richards wasn't just a victim, he was an instrument. Carver had conditioned him to act, to kill, to follow his every command without question. What had started as psychological manipulation had turned into a nightmare far worse than Donovan could have imagined. Richards had been broken, stripped of his autonomy, and turned into a weapon, a puppet on strings. Donovan's gaze never left Richards as he backed up slowly, his eyes darting to the gun at his waist. His hand trembled, but he knew what needed to be done. He couldn't let Carver win. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. But as he stepped forward, the room seemed to shift. The walls of the asylum creaked, as if they were closing in on him. The air grew thicker, more suffocating, as Carver's laugh echoed in the space between them. "Do you really think you can stop me, Donovan?" Carver taunted, stepping forward with calculated, deliberate movements. "You're part of this. You always have been. The smiley face, the drownings, everything. I didn't just manipulate Jason. I manipulated you, too. You've been playing my game since the very beginning." Donovan's chest tightened as Carver's words sank in. It was true, Carver had been feeding him just enough information to keep him hooked, just enough to make him believe he was in control. Every twist in the case, every step forward, had been part of the killer's plan to keep him on the hook. The smiley face, the symbol of the killer's dominance, had been Carver's mark from the start. It was more than a signature. It was a taunt, a reminder that Carver was always watching. "Stop it, Carver," Donovan shouted, his voice hoarse with frustration. "You've destroyed lives. This ends now." Carver smiled wider, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "Destroyed lives? No, Donovan. I've liberated them. I gave them purpose. They're part of something bigger than themselves. And now, so are you." The words hit Donovan like a physical blow. Carver wasn't just a killer. He was a predator. A man who thrived on control, on playing with the minds of others, on twisting them until they were nothing but shadows of themselves. Carver had manipulated every single person involved in this case, including Donovan. Every step he had taken had been guided, whether Donovan realized it or not. But Donovan wasn't going to let Carver have the final word. He could feel the rage boiling inside him, fueled by the injustice, the terror, and the pain that Carver had caused. He wasn't going to let Carver win. Not today. With a sudden movement, Donovan drew his gun and aimed it at Carver. Richards, still under the killer's control, took a step forward, his body stiff as a board. "Jason!" Donovan yelled, his voice trembling with desperation. "Please listen to me. You're stronger than this." But Richards didn't respond. His eyes remained blank, empty, devoid of any emotion or recognition. He was a shell, a vessel for Carver's madness. Carver raised his hands, almost in mock surrender. "Go ahead, Donovan. Pull the trigger. You'll be just like me then, won't you? Another victim in my experiment." The tension in the air was palpable. Donovan's finger hovered over the trigger, his mind racing. He could end it right here, right now. One shot. Carver's reign of terror would be over. But would that really solve anything? Would it truly bring justice? Donovan's mind flashed back to everything Carver had done, everything that had led him to this point. The bodies, the victims, the twisted psychological games. He had been manipulated, yes, but in the end, the decision was his. And then, in a sudden moment of clarity, Donovan lowered his gun. The air seemed to settle, the tension thick and suffocating. "You're not going to win, Carver," Donovan said through gritted teeth. "Not now, not ever." Carver's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, but it quickly turned back into that familiar, twisted smile. "You think you can stop me? You think you can take me down just like that?" Donovan took a step forward, his resolve hardening. "You've already lost, Carver. You're not the one in control anymore." Carver's smile faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can stop this? You think you can take away everything I've built?" Donovan didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward Richards, who was still standing motionless. "Jason," he said softly, taking a step closer. "I know you can hear me. You're stronger than this. You're not a killer. You never were." For a moment, there was nothing. The silence in the room was deafening, save for the faint hum of the broken lights above. But then, something shifted. Richard's eyes twitched, his pupils constricting as if he were slowly waking from a deep, unnatural sleep. "Jason," Donovan said again, his voice steady, and then it happened. Richards blinked, his face momentarily contorted with confusion. "Donovan?" he whispered, his voice weak and strained. Donovan's heart surged with hope. "Jason, you're free. You're not a puppet anymore." The smiley face on the wall, Carver's symbol, his mark, suddenly seemed far less powerful. The predator's hold was loosening, slipping away as Richards took a hesitant step back, his gaze still unfocused but slowly clearing. He looked at Carver, his former controller, and his expression twisted in disgust. "No," Richards muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "No more." Carver's eyes widened in shock. "What's happening?" he hissed. "You can't, this isn't how it was supposed to end." But it was too late. Richards, slowly but surely, was reclaiming his own will, his own strength. The darkness that Carver had cultivated for so long was starting to unravel. And Donovan wasn't going to let Carver take it back. The room seemed to pulse with the power of that moment. The killer, who had once been untouchable, was losing his grip. "Jason," Donovan said, "you're not alone. We'll get you out of this." Carver's world was crumbling before him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The moment felt suspended in time, an eerie stillness that hung in the air like a thread waiting to snap. Donovan stood there, gun still in hand, his gaze locked on Jason Richards as the young man fought to break free from the last vestiges of Carver's control. The twisted, smiley-faced emblem that had haunted them for so long now seemed almost insignificant, its power dissipating with each second that passed. Jason's eyes flickered, the fog lifting from them as if the veil had been pulled back from his mind. The clarity in his gaze was the first sign of hope Donovan had seen in days. I don't know what's happening," Jason muttered, his voice hoarse. I remember everything. But I couldn't stop, couldn't think." "You're free now, Jason," Donovan said, his voice steady, even though his heart was racing. "You're not controlled anymore. You're not his puppet." Carver, who had been standing silently watching the exchange, let out a frustrated hiss. His twisted smile, which had been a fixture of his face for so long, faltered as he took a step forward. "You think you've won? You've only just begun to understand what I've created. Jason is mine. You can't undo what's been done." Donovan turned to face Carver, his gaze steely. The fear in the killer's eyes was palpable now, the first crack in the facade he had so carefully crafted. "It's over, Carver," Donovan said coldly. "This ends here. No more games." Carver's smile twisted into something darker, more desperate. "You think you can stop me, Donovan? You think you can just take me down like some criminal? You're as much a part of this as I am. You're just as much a puppet in this game as anyone else." The words stung, but Donovan didn't flinch. He had learned that Carver thrived on provoking, on twisting his victims' minds, on making them question their reality. Donovan wasn't falling for it anymore. "Jason, look at me," Donovan said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "You're stronger than this. You're free. Don't let him pull you back." Jason's face contorted with emotion, fear, confusion, and then, finally, something else, resolve. He stepped away from Carver, each movement becoming more sure, more self-directed. "No more," Jason whispered, his voice breaking. "No more killing. No more smiles." Carver's face twisted in fury. "You fool. You'll never be free. You can't escape me." But Jason took another step back, away from Carver, and that was the moment Carver knew he had lost. His control over Jason was slipping away, and no amount of manipulation, no amount of psychological games could keep his grip on him any longer. Jason looked directly at Carver, his eyes finally clear. "You're nothing. Just a man who thinks he can play God." With those words, the last semblance of Carver's power crumbled. Donovan moved toward Carver, his gun now aimed at the killer. It wasn't the victory he had imagined, the twisted grin of the murderer, the smug satisfaction of bringing him to justice. Carver wasn't a hero's villain, not the kind that could be neatly tied up in a bow. Carver was a broken man, broken by his own arrogance, by his belief that he could manipulate the world around him into his own sick game. "Do it, Donovan," Carver sneered, his eyes burning with malice. "End it. You've already been part of this." Donovan didn't hesitate. "No," he said firmly. "This ends with you." With a sharp motion, he brought Carver's reign of terror to a halt. The silence that followed the shot was deafening, a long breath held in time. Jason's body trembled as he stood there, taking in the weight of the moment. The silence stretched on until he finally spoke, his voice shaky but clear. "It's over, right?" Jason asked, his eyes meeting Donovan's. Donovan nodded. "It is. You're free." Jason's eyes filled with tears, the raw emotion spilling over. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't want any of this. I didn't know how to stop him." Donovan stepped forward, putting a hand on Jason's shoulder. "You didn't ask for this, Jason. You've been manipulated your entire life. But you've made it out. You're free." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Donovan let out a long, steadying breath. The killer was gone, the game had ended. The smiles, those haunting, mocking symbols, had lost their power. The authorities arrived soon after, taking Carver's body and beginning the grim task of sorting through the wreckage of his manipulation. As they processed the scene, Donovan stayed close to Jason, watching him as he took tentative steps toward his own future. "You'll be okay, Jason," Donovan said quietly as the two of them watched the chaos unfold. "You don't have to face this alone." Jason nodded, his eyes still lost in thought. "I don't know what's next," he admitted softly. "But I'm not that person anymore. I'm not a puppet." Donovan gave him a small, reassuring smile. "One step at a time. We'll figure it out." As they walked out of the asylum together, the weight of the past seemed to lift, if only slightly. They still had a long road ahead. Jason would have to face the scars of what had happened, the trauma that had been inflicted on him, but he was free. And for the first time in a long time, Donovan felt the smallest spark of hope. The game was over. The predator had been stopped. And though it wasn't a clean ending, it was enough.